Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, Dana Fisher, Director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, Professor at the School of International Service at American University, author of Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. Dana, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
Let's start with, I guess, just the broad strokes here. Sorry, I just lost my notes. You say that we need something called an anthro shift. Before we get to that, like, where are we in terms of assessing how well the fighting climate change movement has been up to this point?
Well, I mean, let's start first with just thinking about how our society is handling the threat of the climate crisis. And so far, we're doing a pretty terrible job. We are nowhere near where we need to be in terms of reducing contributions to, anthropomorphic global change in terms of thinking about emissions of greenhouse gases. I mean, greenhouse gases continue to go up at, with a slope that's very similar. You can kind of see it here. The slope continues at the same rate, even though places like the United States are using more and more clean energy. We're continuing to consume more. So we're continuing to emit as much, if not, the same rate of greenhouse gases as before. And that is the problem, because as long as those concentrations continue to go up, the world is going to continue to warm. And we are right now facing multiple risks simultaneously, right? We've got the Park Fire here in the United States. Out west, we've got, I believe, a hurricane just made landfall over in Florida, just like an hour ago or something. So that's the second hurricane to hit the United States so far this year, and it is August 5th. And we're sitting in a heat dome. So here in Washington, D.C., it's going to be just about 100 degrees for I don't know how many days we've had so far. So we're experiencing lots of the effects of the climate crisis, and we're just not doing what we need to do.
When we say we, or when you say we, are we talking about we as in the United States, or are we talking we as a species? Is there a differential there? Does one follow the other? What's the relationship between those things?
Well, so when I say we, I mean we as society broadly defined. However, the climate crisis is caused by those who burn fossil fuels, and those who have higher emissions tend to be those that are wealthier, right? So it is the advanced industrialized nations that have contributed the most to the climate crisis. In fact, we, the United States, has contributed the most absolutely to overall historical emissions. So when I say we, the whole world needs to deal with this, not just like individuals. And when I say we, I certainly do not mean individuals, although a lot of fossil fuel companies have tried to redirect attention away from we as the general society to we as in you and me, and we need to change our power and change our eating and change our driving. It's actually a systemic issue, and the only way to address it is systemically. While that's happening, and it's happening too slowly, what we're seeing is developing countries that are small island nations, are suffering much more of the risk and much more of the effect of the climate crisis. I mean, some countries are actually literally going underwater right now. People are having to evacuate, and they're experiencing the worst of the climate crisis so far. So I do mean we broadly, not just we as a country, but at the same time, some are contributing more than others. And we need to recognize that this is not an equal crisis.
Was there, and I want to get to more towards the solutions, but just, did the movement to fight climate change start on the wrong foot? I mean, because when you say we as individuals can't do this by, we need a policy response. I remember 20 some odd years ago seeing a movie called The Real Inconvenient Truth and I think he was a Green candidate or had been involved in New York Green, which was a response to Al Gore's movie, which is credited, I think, with widely making people aware of climate change, that Gore was talking about, turn off your light bulbs or whatever it was in terms of a reaction, like what we can do as individuals. And that the real inconvenient truth was that we need a more systemic approach. But by that point, I think that movie came out 4 or 5 years later. What's your sense of that?
Well, let me just say, so I was involved in doing research on climate change way back then in ancient history, right? So Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth was actually building off of the work that he did, which was extremely foundational in terms of getting the world to agree to the Kyoto Protocol, which was a legally binding treaty that was written in Kyoto, was finalized in Kyoto in 1997, that if implemented, and the world had followed through on that, and that's mostly developing countries, developed countries, including the United States and Canada and Russia, et cetera, had followed through on their commitments, we would be in a completely different world. So the Inconvenient Truth was it wasn't just about putting on sweaters and turning down the thermostat. It was actually about the inconvenient truth of all the things that had to change in our world. And so while Gore did not really shine a light on the systemic changes that were needed, I don't think it's fair to say that he wasn't recognizing the way that this was a political issue, because I think that he probably did the most to try to do something about the issue, but it just didn't work out the way he planned. As we remember, 2000 election.
And then George Bush, and then George Bush came in and basically killed the Kyoto protocols for all intents and purposes, I guess. And so
the Senate helped too. I would just say the Senate.
Yes.
Helped.
Well, I mean, that was in the air, as it were. I just remember what was her name? Whitman, Christy Todd Whitman, telling me somewhere around 2010 that if liberals hadn't been so aggressive about climate change, maybe conservatives wouldn't deny that it was a problem.
That's a weird statement, I would say, because anybody who's paid anybody who's paid any attention recognizes that conservatives who are, tend to be sympathetic to fossil fuel interests, or even in the pockets of fossil fuel interests, are going to always support fossil fuel interests. And the inconvenient truth, here it is actually that as long as we want to support fossil fuel expansion, we can never address the climate crisis adequately unless the silver bullet emerges that doesn't exist today that makes it possible to burn fossil fuels while not contributing to the climate crisis. So carbon capture and storage and something like that. If that ever were scalable, which it's not, perhaps we could continue the way we are now. But otherwise, we need systemic changes.
With all that said about what Gore was able to do, and we can go over what the Biden administration, their report card, essentially. At the end of the day, you write that we can't rely on, Kamala Harris is not going to necessarily save us.
Kamala Harris had a chance. I mean, she could have saved us. I mean, she has a history of running. When she ran in 2019, right? She actually said she was going to stop fracking in the United States. If she stopped fracking in the United States, that would be huge, because it would basically stop the natural gas boom that's happening in our country. It would substantially reduce our carbon footprint as a country, and it would put us on a completely different path. It would also infuriate a bunch of swing states and a bunch of red states. And she has said, I believe on the 28th of July, she said that she has stepped back from that position. So there are things that somebody in political power can do. It's just that it's about systemic change that's going to mean that political interests and capital interests, that is fossil fuel interests, which have privileged access to both natural resources but also political power in our country at this point, are going to be very unhappy with it. And nobody wants to, poke the bear if it were. But the problem is, if you're not going to poke the bear, lots of polar bears are going to drown, and a lot of people who live on the coast are also going to experience the climate crisis. And we're going to see it, these climate shocks that we're experiencing now are the least that we're going to ever experience in the rest of our lifetime, right? Because they're just going to get worse and worse and come more frequently, because that's the effect of, concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
So in terms of moving forward, though, the fundamental thing that people have to understand is that the systemic problem we have, it's almost on twofold. We have a systemic political problem, and we have a systemic sort of like economic problem, both of which contribute to our inability, or both of which contribute to climate change, I guess, and to global warming. And we can't get to the second one unless we address the systemic political problem, the first one. So what's the best way to do that
so-
at this juncture too? I mean, they've had quite a run up in terms of like being able to figure this out. And we should say also, just in the context of the fracking, we are now the world's greatest producer of fossil fuel, I guess, broadly speaking.
We export more natural gas and more oil now than any other country in the world.
Has ever.
Yeah.
Has
no,
it
I
ever?
don't know. No, not. I don't know if it's as ever, but at the moment, we are number one in the world in terms of exporting fossil fuels, which is coming under the most climate aggressive president we've ever had, right?
All right. Well, let's talk. I mean, just let's do that just so that we can get that, on the table as well. Biden's record. There's some things that he's done that have been really good. Some things not so great. Give us the sort of the top of the good and the bad.
Well, the top of the good is that, I've for over 25 years, I've been studying climate policymaking in the United States. I've written a ton of papers about failed climate efforts, failed climate legislation. And this is the first time I ever got to publish one that was a success through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was not what Biden had wanted. Biden came in with the more aggressive Build Back Better Act. He couldn't get it through the Congress. So we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most aggressive piece of climate legislation that's ever been passed. And it was thanks to President Biden. And President Biden, beyond that, has invested widely in a clean energy transition. If we were not sitting, looking over the precipice of the climate crisis, this kind of incremental policymaking, if it had happened in 2000, we'd be golden, right? It's just we don't have time for it at this point. So I would just say that, Biden's done a lot, but it's just not enough given where we are. And the things that have gone poorly is that the Biden administration has continued to approve and expand fossil fuel consumption of fossil fuel infrastructure building, right? They approved the Willow Project. They allowed the deal, which granted the Inflation Reduction Act probably wouldn't have been passed if there hadn't been a deal with Senator Manchin, right, which basically tied clean energy expansion to fossil fuel expansion, right? So they go hand in hand. All of that, though, means that we have companies in the United States that are continuing to build out more infrastructure to extract more fossil fuels. And all of the science says that we need to have basically, flattened out our expansion or our consumption, and then we need to start going down on our consumption by 2030. And we're not, we're going up. We continue to go up, and we're sending it elsewhere. So even though in the United States we have more clean energy, we're continuing to extract more and send it all over the world to anybody who will buy it.
First off, let me note that the idea that if something had been done 24 or 23 years earlier would have made such a dramatic difference really points out the rate in which we are sort of like the amount of time, how quickly we're running out of time.
We are definitely running out of time. I mean, there's so many indications of that, and yet people aren't paying attention.
Just put in context the pause on the liquid natural gas export facility. I spoke to Bill McKibben in February. I think it was just literally weeks before he was planning to go down and get arrested in protest of that facility, and we got the permitting pause. How important is it, and how durable is that pause?
Well, I mean, first of all, the Secretary of Energy said very, very explicitly in her speeches that it was a temporary pause. So everybody who, screamed from the rooftops that the climate movement won, I think they're fooling themselves. It was a pause. It was a political maneuver. Unfortunately, it's pausing building out additional fossil fuel infrastructure, but there's already infrastructure in place that is being built and expanding our capacity now. So, as we're number one in terms of fossil fuel exporting in the world, we're the number one in natural gas, extraction. Do we really need to be more? I mean, that's an interesting question that I think it's worth asking. And certainly if you want to say that we want to celebrate a pause, it's just hard to celebrate that while we continue to extract so substantially. And
does
we
it
export it all over.
I mean, my understanding of the positive of it is that it inhibits investment. It makes the investment in this technology, if you will, more risky, and that on some level, the idea. I mean, even like I think it was Andreas Malm we had on a couple of years ago was like, you blow up a pipeline and eventually investors start going like, this may not be the best place for me to invest my money. And other investments begin to sort of be able to compete with that.
Sure, if the pause lasts long enough. But remember, this is a pause. We're not talking about stopping, not canceling a project.
Right.
Nothing was canceled. In fact, I think that on Biden's watch, more public lands have opened up to fossil fuel extraction than during the Trump administration, which is, I think, a notable thing. And that would go in the negative, category in terms of, climate losses, which is why basically in the end, and goes back to the question you asked me originally, I say that because of where we are politically, where we are economically, the only way that we can realistically imagine that we can save ourselves is through civil society and through a climate movement that, pushes against power in a way that we haven't seen before.
Okay, so walk us through what that looks like, and then you also talk about both. Like, there's got to be an insider and outsider game. Let's talk about the outsider game, then we'll talk about the insider game.
Sure. I mean, well, I think that in some ways it's impossible to imagine the role that a movement can play if it doesn't involve insiders and outsiders, because a movement plays off of itself, right? It is a broad movement. So in terms of the climate movement, you have both activists who are going to work inside and lobby and work hard to put pressure from the inside on policymakers through the political system. And that is, as lobbyists, as folks who are, constituents, but then they also put pressure on the outside. And so in the book, what I talk about is what we call, the radical flank. And I'm using my air quotes here because this radical flank that we're seeing in the climate movement, as much as people are getting upset about, degradable paint being poured on Stonehenge or soup being thrown on a covering of it, a famous work of art, this is not particularly radical in comparison to previous social movements where their buildings were blown up and facilities.
People forget, like in the 80s, there was something like, 55 bombings over the course of that decade, maybe more.
Yeah. I mean, and if we think back even during the period, the height of the women's, struggle for women's suffrage, a building was blown up a month. I mean, and people died, right? And now we're talking about throwing a little tomato soup. I mean, and it's not that I'm saying you should destroy art. No artwork has been destroyed thus far.
Right.
So, so there's that. So anyway, I talk about the radical flank, which is the component of the climate movement that is expanding to try to draw more attention to the issue. And that is a very common progression in a social movement when a social movement hasn't achieved its goals. I mean, either a movement dies out because people just give up and they go back to doing something else, or, and in this case, the world is warming and we're personally experiencing more and more climate, shocks every day. So that's not going to happen. Instead, we see more and more people getting fed up with going through this insider type of activism and taking to the streets and engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. And in it, as I talk about in the book, we see right now groups that are using performative protest. That's the soup throwers, the paint throwers, the crazy gluers, the people who do the slow walking. We're seeing a lot of it around Citibank right now in New York City, with people blocking Citibank's entrance and other banks that are investing in fossil fuel extraction. These are very performative acts of nonviolent civil disobedience to draw attention to the climate crisis. We also see groups that are what I call disruptors in the book, and those are groups that are engaging in broader campaigns where they're working as insiders, they're working to get banks to move money, they're working as personal investors, but then they do these moments of nonviolent civil disobedience so they can draw attention to this broader campaign. And both of those are necessary components of the climate movement right now. And as I talk about in the book, that will continue to expand as more and more people feel the effects of the climate crisis. When they feel it firsthand, people are going to put pressure on, powers that be, both at the local level, at the national level, theoretically at the international level, although that's a lot harder to imagine how that will work. And that's all going to be needed for the kinds of systemic changes to happen that are needed.
What has to be done in terms of contextualizing that experience so that people know that they're experiencing what they're experiencing is a function of climate change, right? I mean, this is a problem, analogous to tell the government to get their hands off my Medicare. Like there's not necessarily a one-to-one understanding, because it's, it increases the severity of storms. It increases the likelihood of storms. It's a little bit more abstract than, say, I don't know, a street corner where 10 people have been hit by a car. We need to change the traffic pattern there.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. So the climate crisis basically is exacerbating normal weather patterns, right? So we see more drought, more floods, more tornadoes, more severe everything, right? We're seeing more severe hurricanes, and we're seeing them more severe in terms not of the wind, which is how hurricanes are measured, but rather in terms of the amount of water that falls, because hurricanes are going over climate change exacerbated heated waters, right? In terms of the sea surface temperature. And that means that the hurricanes suck up more warm water and they have more water to rain down on. So we're seeing that too. So it makes it harder to understand it. And there's also been a misinformation campaign that's been leveraged by companies that are associated with fossil fuel interests to try to make it a little harder to understand that. I mean, it's pretty easy to say, this hurricane is so much worse because the water in the Gulf is so much warmer than it's supposed to be. And that means that X amount of water is falling more than we would normally expect. I mean, it's still somewhat abstract, but I don't think it's that hard to understand. I mean, everybody's experiencing how much warmer it is. Just look at the map today. I mean, I just was looking at the New York Times this morning, and you can just see the whole map, and just everything's red.
No,
that's not really normal.
This summer it has not relented in New York. Usually what you get for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe, or 2 weeks or a week, has been, I think we're on like week 8 now.
Yeah, and it's why they're calling it the summer of heat, right? And we're just in the beginning of August, so it's just going to continue. And the hurricanes, we're about to hit where hurricanes really start to get us.
Is there a cohort that needs to be activated? Is there a specific cohort? Because I mean, we could say, okay, it's not hard to understand that warmer waters create warmer storms. I would argue that, for a lot of people, it is harder to understand than it might be for, the people listening to our conversation and us. People don't know, there's a lot of things that people don't know. Also, there's not just, to beat my analogy up a little bit, it's not just a question of the car hitting people. Maybe people can understand that dynamic, but they don't necessarily understand the relationship, what's going on building the car. Where did the car come from? The man-made portion, right? Because we've seen the right, at least in this country, go from there is no climate change to, well, there's climate change, but that's God. And God does it, and God will step in and it'll change. It's not man-made, that type of thing. And then if there is, well, maybe it was man-made, but man can't do anything about it. Is there a cohort out there? How much of the society do we need to change the dynamic so that Kamala Harris can say, I'm going to stick with that fracking ban?
Well, so that's a great question. So I would just say that what we really need is there to be this critical mass that's putting pressure on politicians in power or politicians running for office that empowers them to step up to fossil fuel interests and give them the capacity to believe that they're not going to lose power if they make these decisions. I mean, one of the biggest challenges here is the timeline of addressing climate change is not the same. It's not 4 years, right? It's not the period of time that somebody is in the presidency. It's not 2 years, the amount of time somebody is in a congressional office. However, starting to build a fossil fuel, infrastructure like the Willow Project or something, you can actually put money into that, and your constituents will see that today. Whereas if Kamala Harris decides to do a fracking ban, there is going to be a period of time where people are going to lose jobs, lose money, worry that they're not going to have enough natural resources to run, the air conditioning or the heat, depending on where you live. Although more and more the air conditioning over the heat, of course, right? And so given that, there needs to be enough people to push back against that. And one of the things I would just say that I think is really interesting is that young people across the board are concerned about the climate crisis. In fact, there are a bunch of groups that, let's say a handful of groups of young conservatives who are concerned about the climate crisis, who spent most of the Republican National Convention walking around trying to find somebody to talk to about climate change, because all of the people who are running the party over there are like, climate change isn't happening, et cetera, like you were talking about. But young people care about this. And one of the things that we know is that they feel very anxious about the climate crisis and worried for their future. And we saw that during 2019, 2020, until the pandemic stopped us. We saw that it really was pushing lots of young people to get politically active. What we really need is for those young people not to feel anxious. I mean, and anxiety is a natural component of the climate crisis for sure, and a natural emotion for people to feel. We need them to feel angry. When people feel angry, they have this sense of efficacy and they feel like they can do something about it. And the more people feel angry about this issue and are willing to vote on it, not say they're not going to vote, because not voting basically takes you out of the entire process, right? So you don't get a say. But if you say you're going to vote against somebody if they're not going to ban fracking, that actually could matter. And that's the kind of political power that's needed and the pressure that's needed from the citizenry, from civil society. I don't know that that will happen, though, until we experience many more climate shocks where many more people become unhoused and really feel the effects of the climate crisis firsthand.
But is an electoral strategy like that, A, effective, and B, well, I think you would argue it's probably insufficient, but is it effective? Because we can say we're not going to vote for Kamala Harris because she's walked back on the fracking ban. But the reality is, I mean, in this instance, RFK sadly is also has said that climate change is just really, he's a conservationist of sorts, but his climate change for him apparently is just a mechanism for authoritarian control. And Donald Trump has basically said, the EPA is going to be outlawed from using the words. I mean, so I'm not clear where the electoral strategy, the electoral leverage is there, A. But B, if 18 to 34-year-olds are already there, maybe their attitude towards this, they feel disempowered, so they don't have the proper sort of perspective. They need to be angry instead of like the anxiety that comes with a certain amount of fatalism. What's the cohort that either A, feels empowered or is empowered? I mean, because if I had a choice between I want to mobilize 500,000 18 to 34-year-olds, let's say, versus I've got every one of the board of directors of ExxonMobil who are going to do what I say, I would take the latter in that instance, because they control the levers in a way that, but I imagine the answer has got to be somewhere in between those.
It absolutely is. Well, I was just saying, so here's it. I mean, first and foremost, the board of directors of ExxonMobil are never, ever going to agree to phase out.
No, I know
okay,
that.
So
I was a complete hypothetical.
It's really important to say it. So we cannot have faith in these fossil fuel interests, even if they say they're going to do stuff, because so many of them have backtracked on their commitments in the past
of course.
year or two. Okay. And what I would just also say that my example around young people and supporting electoral politics is actually to point out. So young people don't tend to vote, and young people need to vote. And I am absolutely not saying that they should not support Kamala Harris. I'm saying they should support Kamala Harris, but they should also be pushing her to be as aggressive as she can be to address these issues, right? So she historically has supported a Green New Deal. She historically supported a fracking ban. Will they be able to get that by asking her to do it during the 2024 election? Absolutely not. But I think constituents who vote, who say that, is part of the solution. The other part of the solution, as I talk about in the book, is that what we're going to have to see is many more people, and that's working as insiders, right? To go back to what we were saying before. But we also need people working as outsiders and playing a role in putting pressure on these power brokers and people in power to recognize that they are going to lose legitimacy if they don't take a stand and push for systemic change. And that's something that I think, and as I talk about in the book, is going to only come with more pain and suffering, because otherwise business as usual always wins, and we're going to see it continue to win. And we're going to see it push on progressive candidates to become more mainstream. because we see the deck is stacked against the general public and against addressing the climate crisis because of so many resources in the pockets and in the hands of fossil fuel interests.
Are there interests that we take for granted, and I think it's a safe assumption, that ExxonMobil and entities like that, they're always going to be on the wrong side of this. They're impossible. It's impossible for them to do anything otherwise. Is there a cohort of industry or individuals or populations that are sort of 50-50? Make a little bit of money from fossil fuel, but we could make more from this other thing. And maybe if fossil fuel becomes that much more problematic, not in terms of like what the studies say, but rather in terms of our bottom line, whatever that bottom line is, politically, economically, or financially, just socially, where's that cohort?
Well, I would just say that, so what we see right now is that there are numerous clean energy companies, right? Companies that are making a profit off of battery storage, expansion of clean energy, wind energy, that do have capacity like you're talking about. But in a lot of places, those companies are actually fossil fuel companies, or components of fossil fuel companies, right? That are expanding out wind energy in Ohio, wind energy in Texas. And when they're embedded in part of this broader kind of fossil fuel mix, it's very hard to take a stand one against the other. I can imagine a world in which, for example, if fossil fuel subsidies no longer existed in this country, a lot of folks on boards of directors for energy companies broadly might say, hey, it's actually a lot more profitable for us to be investing in clean energy versus the dirty energy. But right now, with subsidies being what they are, it doesn't really work out that way. But that could change. And that could be something that a president could do.
So it seems like the idea is that in addition to people having a greater awareness and attempting to exert political pressure within the inside game, the outside game has to increase, while simultaneously, essentially, it's almost like an accelerationist argument on some level. Things have just got to be worse, but those who are advocating for this systemic change need to be in the game. So when those things happen, they are both interpreted and acted upon in a way that is much quicker than would otherwise be.
I think that's true. I mean, actually, a number of climate groups and different social movement organizations that work around climate change are starting to set up, like, basically programs where they're having people sign up for doing, being available when disaster hits in your community, to start to shine a light on the way that both we need to build back in a more resilient way that is aware of the kind of, crisis that we're in and the types of shocks that we're probably going to experience, but also take those moments to shine a light on the way that the climate crisis and fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel consumption is leading to the problem. And I think that that's absolutely necessary. I mean, we know that we are all going to be hit with a lot more climate shocks before we address the problem sufficiently. That's unfortunate, but that is just the truth. So it's really about preparing to change the narrative, because right now the narrative really doesn't go there. It's very hard to get a lot of meteorologists to talk about the way that climate change is playing a role in these problems and these events, right?
Are there organizations that you think are doing this better than others? I mean, for the sake of people listening, if they wanted to get involved in these organizations, from ones that have the more radical tactics, because I don't think the ideas are necessarily radical as much as within the context of our society, the tactics in certain instances, like the ideas associated with putting paint on a statue, or tomato soup on a statue is, I guess, outside the norm of polite conversation. But I get,
as my research shows, nobody is talking about blowing up pipelines right now. Nobody. So this is not about radical violent tactics. This is maybe radical, radical in terms of performative radical tactics to get attention, right? And the whole idea is for it to help to increase what we call salience, right? Climate salience in the media. So we talk about it more. So more people think about it and draw the lines between the crazy heat wave we're experiencing or the drought we're experiencing or the way that the hurricane is going to devastate Savannah, Georgia, all of those things and connect the dots, right? That's the reason they're doing it. With regard to groups that are doing a really good job, I would just say that I think that there's some interesting organizing taking place by Sunrise, the Sunrise movement, which has these really, really impressive locally embedded hubs that take place that exist all over the country and a lot of campuses. On my campus, on American University's campus, we have a wonderful hub. I think they're doing a really interesting job. The Green New Deal Network has done some really interesting work, and they do work where they both work as outsiders, but they also are connected with elected officials and working there to think about how to capitalize on shocks when shocks happen to, and basically the idea that, we know that windows of opportunity open after disaster. And the idea is how do you take advantage of that to transition us to a cleaner, better future? So I think those are two groups that are working like as outsiders, but, very much in an embedded way in communities.
And groups like Extinction Rebellion, who are doing more. It seems to me like a lot of that performative, so-called performative, like protests.
Well, Extinction Rebellion in New York City has been doing a lot of that. We're going to see there's going to be a cello concert in front of Citibank on Thursday, which is brought to you by a coalition of groups, including Extinction Rebellion. I mean, also Climate Defiance, which has gotten attention for bird dogging elected officials and, leaders of different banks and fossil fuel companies. They're doing some really interesting work as well. So those are all these outsiders that are getting a lot of attention. I also think we need to talk about Third Act in there. They're the Rocking Chair Rebellion. That's Bill McKibben's group. And they are doing some really interesting work that's both insider and outsider. They're working on drawing attention to the way that banks are investing in fossil fuel expansion while also using nonviolent civil disobedience in a really performative way. They have these beautiful, hand-painted rocking chairs that they sit in and rock in front of the entrance to a bank, so you can't really get inside. So, I mean, there are so many of them. And one of the things that my research has documented is how there is this, many flowers bloom kind of approach where all these different groups are springing up. And we're going to see so many more because as disaster hits, people start to form associations and start to think together and build these collectives to address the problem. And they do it at the local level, which is exactly where the problems are happening and where we need to start. But it obviously has to scale up to have the effects that are needed.
All right, we're going to put links to all of those groups in our website. And just lastly, you write about these actions are sometimes unpopular on their face, but do we have data that show that they are actually effective long term?
Well, what we do know, so more research is needed, and unfortunately, I am constantly saying this. If you're interested in that, I wrote a piece in Nature magazine that came out in November that specifically talks about all the research that's still needed. But what we do know is it actually, to date, the radical.
You're breaking up just a bit. Yeah, now we can. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Nope.
What I was going to say is the research on the radical flank has documented the way that while the groups that are doing these kinds of tactics are not popular, they never have been popular. If you look back to the civil rights period, groups that were engaging in radical tactics then were not popular. However, what they do is they draw attention to the issue and they draw support for more moderate factions of the movement. And the research that has actually looked at actual climate activism documents that exact process is happening now. There are other folks who have done more abstract research, not on specific actions with a specific people who have experienced the activism, and they have come to differing conclusions, but the work that's gone into the peer review actually does show that quite substantially. We need to do more research, but as a social scientist, I always have to say that. But it's true. We could get a lot more if we did more tailored research.
Dana Fisher, Director of the Center for Environment, Community and Equity, and Professor at the School of International Service at American University. The book is Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube descriptions, as well as a list of those organizations if folks want to get involved in that now. And to the extent that we have research, it's encouraging that the groups themselves may not be popular, but you're not trying to win a popularity contest. You're trying to create social change. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.